Hey everyone, thanks for joining us for another OWASP meetup. And we are really appreciative of you all being here. And I don't want to take up too much of your time. So I'm just going to say we have an event that we are trying to plan for next month, which will likely be in person again. So hopefully you all haven't grown too tired of these virtual meetups and we can actually start regularly meeting up in real life. Without any further ado, I'm going to bring on Paul Brownridge. He's an expert in the IoT field, particularly with devices I have no experience with, which is oil rigs and cars are always pretty fun. But here we go, Paul.
All right.
So thank you for joining us. Thank you for coming on. I know it's exceptionally late there, so I'm really appreciative of you being here and sharing your expertise. And so I'm going to jump off, let you take over. But if you have any questions, those of you watching, just please let us know in the comments and we'll ask them away. So thank you.
Cool.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for the introduction. I'm very happy to be presenting for OWASP again. And basically, a little bit of a background about the talk. This is the greatest hits of some of the research that we've done in the spheres of IoT and maritime and automotive. And we're finding that there's so many strands that are holding these things together these days. So it's nice to get like sort of a coherent talk. I'm going to do the obligatory. Who am I? Well, I started my working life as an engineer on refineries and other chemical processing plants, and it's given me a sort of a nice background to launch into operational technology testing and a lot of SCADA systems, etc., etc. I tend to do quite a lot of testing in APIs, cloud, a lot of general stuff, and some hardware as well, which I'm lucky to do. We're a team of 120 testers. We run the gamut from automotive, trains, planes, and automobiles. We've got some of the guys are ex-mariners, and we even have an ex-pilot on board as well, which helps us with aviation testing. Cool. All right, so what are we going to be looking at? Oil rigs, some toys, IoT toys. We're going to be looking at ships, cars, automotive stuff, hardware-specific vulnerabilities, particularly when it comes to chain attacks, and emerging and recent technologies. We're finding there's a big push towards convergence, where you no longer have discrete systems. You have logical separation between things. And we find that the prevalence of cloud is starting to make inroads even to things like PLCs or that you find a critical national infrastructure. But I mean, why speak about cars? Why speak about IoT stuff? Why speak about trains? Well, there's so many similarities these days. Nobody reinvents the wheel. So network topology is the same. And talk about the phenomenon of network convergence. So no longer discrete. You got GSMs, GSM networks. We've got APNs. So we have this what used to be the remit of phone or cellular networks now is being used to connect monitoring stations in the field of a refinery somewhere, or on rolling stock in the middle of the desert on a train. Serial communications still very, very ubiquitous all over the world, particularly when it comes to things like SCADA, for instance. Telematics, which we're finding, we'll talk about a little bit later in cars. GPS, for instance. Well, GPS everywhere, and has been for a while. And interfaces for APIs, IoT, web interfaces, Bluetooth. You get web interfaces now with your, you always had it for routers, for instance, or your IoT devices. So what used to be the remit of financial companies, you now find it being co-opted to control and administer certain devices. So since the presentations about lessons learned in the past, we're going to be talking a lot, and I'm going to be demonstrating a lot that where we should be learning our lesson is we're not. We're finding the same mistakes being repeated time and time again. We have poor authentication, exposed admin interfaces, poor coding practices, over-reliance on physical security, patching or lack of patching, insufficient segregation between disparate networks, and lack of accountability with third parties and vendors. And particularly this is on, I think, a very topical subject when it comes to supply chain attacks. Network convergence, as mentioned earlier on, which we'll touch on. The myth of cloud security. I think anybody who tests these cloud security know that it's only as good as the implementation, particularly when it comes to API, and eventually it's people. We will talk about not so much social engineering, but certainly the habits of people who are doing work to shortcut in order to leave the job a little bit earlier at the end of every day once they've done their stuff. So, OT overview, operational technology. You're finding these are the systems that control processes in the field. So we're talking about refineries, we're talking about chemical plants. They control valves, they route chemicals and the gases and that through different pipes and that. These things are built to last forever and ever. They'll sit in the field for 20, 25 years. They're really updated. And since the main function is productivity, and sometimes lack of productivity can lead to lack of safety, people are very reluctant to shut them down, particularly because you'd have to shut the whole chain down. The resulting is got a very tight ecosystem and specialist skills. You also have, since they're old devices, you have unencrypted protocols. But the plus point is there is gradual improvement coming, but it is very gradual. What we're tending to find is that for many, the security model is still historically physical. Vendors use this as an excuse, and it's not applicable in this day and age. Not when it comes to nation states trying to hack critical national infrastructure. For instance, you could see the command, the PuTTY session on the screen. That is from a serial connection at the back of a PLC. You just walk up to it, you plug that in, no password is necessary. You can take over the PLC, you can monitor the network, get access to the rest of the network. No authentication. We're seeing this time and time again, not just in field, but we're also seeing it in maritime, for instance. We've seen it in power stations, etc. We're finding this is another one that we find cloud management, or the cloud is making ingress into the controlling of these devices, which is cool, which is very, it facilitates ease of administration, but at the same time, as I mentioned before, if you introduce coding practices, if your API exposes buckets or allows you to bypass authentication, you now have access to these remote, the RTU management interfaces and the PLCs. That way, you've introduced now additional vulnerabilities into your system, whereas before, okay, fair enough, physical security wasn't as great, but now, since you're so quick to adopt new technologies, it's so easy to inherit the same sort of vulnerabilities that you get from cloud interfaces, for instance. So, Maritime OT PLCs. So, these are the ones that control the power, the generation, hydraulics, and many other functions. Yet again, we talk about technology co-opted from refineries, for instance. So we bought one. We wanted to check if we could crack it and hack it. We could see what vulnerabilities it had. We found it had no authentication at all, and these systems control the power of the ship, for instance. So we reported to the vendor. Physical security controls are sufficient, which they're not. Port scanning voids the warranty, which is ridiculous. It was such a cop-out by the manufacturer. As part of any testing process, or most testing processes, the first thing you do is port scan it. So very poor, not acceptable, not in this day and age. IoT stuff. So IoT is almost the antithesis of OT technology. It's always connected, short lifespan, very short in some cases, really updated because developers push these things to the market as soon as possible to fill up a gap, for instance, that they fear that other developers or manufacturers or producers are going to fill. So generous skills, messy ecosystem, bad coding practices, for instance, and race to market, race to innovate, which leads to all kinds of hassle. But in this particular instance, we have the Scaladol. It's banned as a listening device in Germany. Why? Well, this piece it's a children's toy, but it's actually quite a clever children's toy. It's the kids can ask it questions. It'll refer back Wi-Fi up to Wikipedia, look for answers to the questions and answer the kids, for instance. But you can also, it's got a GSM unit, so you can call it. You can talk to your kids, for instance, who are busy playing with it. Another function that it has is it can pair up to your phone using Bluetooth. And so you can listen in on what your kid's doing, or you can talk to your kids via the phone. The problem with the Kayla doll is that as soon as the phone that was paired to it moved out of range, it would go into an automatic pairing mode. That means that this doll could have been sitting in the middle of your house, for instance, and your neighbors, whoever had access to that to the Bluetooth that the doll was broadcasting, could pair to it and could listen what was happening in your house, your kids, what you were discussing at dinner, for instance. And that's why, due to our research, Kayla got branded as a listing device and banned for sale in Germany. But surely we wouldn't see these same mistakes in other areas of IoT. Well, wrong. This is a Bluetooth switchgear. You've probably seen them thousands of times as you've been driving down the road. I mean, the main function is to make sure that the grid doesn't get overloaded. As soon as there's any sort of overload, it'll shut, it will open the circuit, and then after a few minutes, it should reclose the circuit. I'm sure that you've had this during blackouts and that, where the power's gone out and it comes back a few seconds later or tens of seconds later. Fortunately, that's not always the case. Oftentimes, the switch doesn't close the circuit again, and an engineer has to be dispatched to the scene. Now, this is quite dangerous work. He's got to clamber up the poles, opens up a box, has to gauge what the problem was and reset the switch. And anytime you have humans and high voltage, it's not a great combination. So there was a switchgear manufacturer decided they were going to integrate IoT technologies in order to automatically close the switch from afar. So we thought this is cool. This will help, this will help prevent any accidents to human lives. But we managed to get one. We took it apart. We noticed that it was in pairing mode all the time, and the Bluetooth pin was 0. And now this time, I would say something like shocking security, but I'm not going to say that. I'm going to move on. Right. So lessons learned: poor authentication, exposed admin interfaces, and poor coding practices. Poor authentication, it's both in the terms of Kayla doll and the switchgear, being in constant pairing mode, and having exposed admin interfaces and weak passwords, unacceptable. Particularly when it comes to the switchgear. If you manage to close it while somebody was up there, it could have had catastrophic consequences. CCTV. This is quite an old one, but I'm just going to refresh it. So this is harking back to the Mirai botnet. Installation of these cameras, and they were pretty ubiquitous all over the place. They were in everybody's homes. But what people didn't know was that it used UPnP, which could talk to certain router boxes and open up the firewall, basically allowing pinholes through. And these were used to administer the cameras via Telnet, which, as a lot of us know, is an insecure administrative protocol. And that's actually giving quite a compliment. At this time, because they were using a series of, I think it was 75 passwords, the attackers were able to brute force the administrative interfaces and gain access to the interiors of people's networks and homes, and create a botnet that took down Facebook and Twitter, etc. And this is something we'll mention later on. As a company, if your company takes on any IoT devices that are connected, it's always great to get a check by a company just to make sure that this sort of thing doesn't happen. Lessons learned: poor authentication, terrible passwords. I mean, we all know there's Mirai botnet password lists on the internet. If you're interested, you could take a look. Exposed admin interfaces and rogue protocols. UMP shouldn't be opening up pinholes in anybody's firewall. That's not a great situation to be in. Right, telematics. So we're going to the automotive portion of the talk. So what is telematics exactly, right? Well, it's the branch of information technology, as defined. Right? It deals with the long-distance transmission of computerized information. But it makes it sound like it's almost a one-way flow of information, which is not true, because cars these days, for instance, that use telematics, it's a two-way. You can talk to a help desk or a help center, for instance, where they can remotely start your car, or if you've been in an accident, they can call an ambulance for you. The way it works is basically the GSM unit that sits with a SIM card, either integrated or that you can pop out, and it uses, as I said, GSM network to communicate with the base station. So we decided, okay, as part of a test, we could pop the card out and put it into our own base station. We could then connect our test machines up to the base station, which then had connectivity back to the car manufacturer. Now, usually, what would happen in this instance? It would be protected by a VPN or a private APN network, which is, we talk about defense in depth, many layers of the security, particularly when it comes to private APNs, which is the private GSM networks. But what we found that there wasn't the case for this network. We were able to, using our test machines connected up to the GSM modem, we were able to get access to the telematics front end, and by using normal penetration testing techniques, we were able to find vulnerabilities on that network that allowed us to take domain admin. And yet again, we'll be finding the same things that you think that years and years ago they would have learned, but things like insufficient segregation between operationally different networks, and even defense in depth, because if the client had spent the time, the money, and the effort in order to undergo a penetration test regularly on that network, we wouldn't have been able to gather that low-hanging fruit and taken over the domain at that point quite easily. Right, hacking ICS systems. So just give you a quick overview of some of these things. So this is an M2M. This connects your PLCs in the fields with the monitoring station, for instance. It updates the PLC, it codes the PLC, and the way that it works is, yet again, it's a GSM connected network. But what we found is that if by default, it presents a web page, a administrative web page, and by using Shodan, we were able to see that there were 3,500 of these connected to the internet out of a total of 210,000 units in total, which is pretty good. And some people are doing the job properly, but also we know that the passwords were ADM/ADM. So password was ADM and the username was ADM. This is very similar, as I'm sure you all know. Your routers, for instance, admin, password, admin, etc., the same thing. One of the good things we found was that the VPN key that it used to communicate back to the base station was encrypted. So it was cool. So we thought, okay, that's a step in the right direction. But then we noticed that whenever we added a user to the interface or we changed the password, it would update the blob of information. So we would notice, okay, so this is probably then it was a roll your own cipher that they managed to install on the devices. So we would change the user name, and then we would see how it's reflected in the rest of the blob. And through iteration, we've noticed that it was a substitution cipher, and using CyberChef, which I'm sure many of you used at a time, we managed to string together an encoding plus a decryption event. We managed to gather the private key and use this private key in order to get access to the routers home bases all over the world. We thought this was quite a cool one, to be quite honest. The client was very concerned at that point in time. But yeah, we were quite proud of that one. So yet again, lessons learned: administrative interfaces exposed to the internet. I mean, this is one-on-one at the end of the day, but people are still forgetting this, particularly when it comes to devices that are connected to critical national infrastructure, for instance. I mean, that might be sitting in a nuclear power plant, for instance, or might be sitting in the field for refinery, or these are things that really need to be embedded in the controls whenever equipment is bought and set up, for instance. Per passwords, default usernames, ADM. It should, on setup, you should be forced to change username and passwords, but that still doesn't happen by default on a lot of the interfaces. And in endpoint encryption, you should enroll your own. Security through obscurity, under any sort of scrutiny, is going to fail, particularly with sufficiently skilled people with enough time. We were talking about, we want an engagement now, and we managed to crack that. Imagine if you had the resources of a nation state, for instance, where you could spend months really delving deep into taking over a lot of the equipment that would control infrastructure, for instance. Right. So, integrated control and monitoring system. Now, this is the maritime portion of the talk. The ICMS is the number one most important piece of equipment on a ship. It is the brains and the eyes and the ears. It monitors all the disparate systems all over. So the PLC out in the engine room, the ballast tanks, for instance, the hull stress monitors, even the temperature of the seawater outside. With this very, very important piece of equipment, the captain and the bridge can monitor, and they can change tons of things such as propulsion, etc. Yeah, without it, that would be absolutely unable to control the ship, and the ship would have to stop. And this makes it a very, very attractive target when we're doing tests on ships. So we obviously take a look at this so very closely. So ideally, this is what you have: the separation of your IT network, which is on the left-hand side, and your OT network, which is on the right-hand side. So your bridge ICMS, your serial controllers, your engine room ICS, etc. But we're finding that's not always the case these days, particularly with convergence, which I'll touch on now. We're going to delve deeper. Just take a look at the corporate network, the IT section. You'll see that we have RDP, which is not the protocol. It's not the remote desktop protocol, but remote distribution points. And these take the feed in from the VSATs, from the satellites, and then distribute it all around the ships into the cabin switches, which are noted by the CSs. So the RDPs are nothing but big boxes of Cisco equipment. Yet again, nobody's reinventing the wheel. This is all consumer-grade stuff, which is then split into the cabin switches, which separate things like the VoIP phone, TV, Wi-Fi, even door control systems. So you don't want any access into your OT system from your IT system. This screenshot is a picture of a load computer. The load computer and the load interface is extremely important because it monitors how many passengers you have, what is your cargo, hull stress, how much water you take in for your ballast. If the data to your load UI or the load server is corrupted enough, you can cause damage to the hull. You can also, if you influence, if there's not enough water in the ballast tanks, the ship will float out will float proud of the water, will be it'll be sloshing around a lot, but if it was very heavy, it would sink quite low in the water and it would be inefficient to move. So the companies are very, very concerned that the load computer and load UI operate as efficiently as possible. So this is one of the things we're looking at. Now, we had known that a third party had come in and loaded the load computer UI and load computer server. Now, they were very, very happy and they're very pleased because when they installed it, they plugged it into a wall wart and they found that the load computer UI and the load computer server were talking to each other. So, like I said, they were overjoyed. They didn't have to tunnel through the bulkhead to get it to communicate with each other. They probably left early, probably had a few beers. They thought, okay, cool, this is great. But the problem with this is we talk about convergence now, and we have separation via VLANs. The way that the ship works is that devices are separated into logical VLANs or different VLANs by the function that they fulfill. So your printers would sit on a certain VLAN, your point of sales machines would sit on a different VLAN, and these were designated by different certificates that they would have. Now, the problem with the low computer UI, the low computer server, is they didn't have a certificate, so they went into what's called the target. It's just basically a catch-all VLAN for all the unassigned devices. So this means that you could be sitting in the pool, for instance, or near the bar. You plug your computer into the closest LAN network point, and now you have access to the low computer server. And because we've tested these systems before, we knew that there was a default username and password with them. And using RDP this time, the remote desktop protocol, we managed to get access to the low computer server. Log in, we had full administrative rights. Now, at the time, you can think that you can do something funky. You can maybe try to take over the engine room, the ICMS and that, but using spoofing techniques, you can DOS the ICMSs by sending a whole lot of junk down the line. By the time, from the low computer server to the IP to serial converters, you sent so much junk that the ICMSs no longer know what is valid information and what is invalid information, causing a denial of service attack. At that point, if the ship was in sea, the captain would have to stop the ship because he had no way of monitoring or controlling the ship. And that is the condition that we managed to find ourselves in at that point. So though it wasn't sexy as steering a ship, for instance, we still managed to prove to the company that we could cause a situation where there would be a financial loss and even reputational loss. So lessons learned: insufficient segregation between IT and OT, convergence again, poor passwords, default usernames, insufficient patching, no patching, particularly because the loaded UI server was out of date. Over-reliance on physical security yes, don't trust third parties because you don't know what they're putting on your network, which I will demonstrate in the next couple of slides. So, still on maritime, hijacking propulsion oil rigs. The client had asked us to do what's called a drive-off test. Now, before I started doing this sort of testing, I always thought that oil rigs were actually stationed over a certain point and anchored into the seabed below, but that's not the case. What happens is there's a flexible drill cable that goes from the oil rig, from the platform, down to the floor. There's a big concrete metal structure, and there's a series of thrusters that, using GPS, make sure that the platform aligns over a certain predefined area. Now, this is very important because if the ship manages to drive off, it's possible that there's a shear of the cable, and even though there's things like blowout preventers that would prevent leakage of oil, this is not 100% reliable, and you could land up with a environmental, reputational, and financial catastrophe for the company. So, having this in mind, that we wanted to prove that it was possible to do a drive-off test, we took a look at the network. So this is a simplified view of the network. You have the satellite feeding in from the global information. You have the core, which splits up all the separate feeds into the remote access VPN, the corporate, because you have admin staff, etc., on the oil rig as well. Third parties, your contractors, and then the crew for them to watch Netflix, etc., get the emails. Then the remote access VPN goes to the DC and the drilling control network. So that's fine. Now we had an overview of what to expect. So we put on the blue suits and the hard hats and the boiler suits, and we went down into the bells of the ship, and we started finding these a lot. And we find these in test after test, particularly with new ships, finding that vendors install a lot of stuff that the original architects and the owners of the ship have no idea. There's so many of them. Particularly, these are jump boxes. These are facilitate administrative tasks by remote IT working staff. This is a good example. Let's say we had 3 remote boxes, but when this particular one caught our eye, we noticed that it had a command shell on the screen, and there was a cable unplugged from it as well. Another thing that we noticed is it had team viewer, naughty. These there was a hack not too long ago of a national infrastructure using team viewer. So this is something that we really need to worry about, something that we see quite often. So we plugged in the cable, the blue cable, just next to the black bar over there. And then what we found is that we were able to connect. Now we had a connection between the corporate network and the drilling control network. On top of that, we noticed that we were picking up DHCP from the corporate network as well. Now, to put this in perspective, we now had a bridge between the internet, the rest of the offices spread out all over the world, and the drilling control network. On top of that, using normal penetration testing techniques, we managed to snuff a few hashes that turned out they were domain administrative hashes. At that point, using pass the hash techniques, which I'm sure a lot of you pen testers know, it's quite easy to do this. You set up responder, NTLM relay X, and then a bunch of computers that don't have SMB signing involved. You blast it off, and we managed to find that we had snuffed the domain admin password, or domain admin hash, and then sitting down in the oil rig, we actually had access to all the offices and all the rigs from our rig, and which was cool for penetration testing. Very sexy, but that wasn't why we got hired for the job. We got hired to do the drive-off test. So now we take a look at the propulsion part. So what we tend to find, particularly all over the world, is there are not many OT manufacturers. One of the biggest ones is Siemens. Siemens is everywhere. They build medical equipment all the way down to so many things. And what we found is Siemens Scalance switches, and then these are everywhere that you go, in every ship, in every oil rig, in every single production plant or conveyor belt, you're going to find Siemens Scalance stuff. They used to route serial data over the internet because serial data can degrade. They're also used to logically split OT environments. So we took a look at this. We bought our own switches so we could reverse engineer. And using JTAG headers at 20, we managed to recover the firmware. And we managed to notice that there was something going on that we weren't certain of. And this, I won't lie, this took quite a few of us quite a lot of time to reverse engineer. Eventually, we found out there was an administrator port / backdoor with quite a simple password. So I got to be said, Siemens were amazing with us. They were really great. Every now and again you can disclose to a manufacturer and they'll fight you tooth and nail, but they acknowledged it, they verified it, they fixed it, and they pushed and they published a patch for this, which is not trivial to do. It's not trivial to install because these things are all over the place, and engineers and architects of these networks tend to not want to bring them down because, for obvious reasons, it brings you have to shut the entire process chain down. But at this point, we had a backdoor, so we could log into the switch, we could disable all the traffic, or we could change the traffic to the PLCs that would control the thrusters. And at this point, we had a bridge between the corporate network, the drilling control network, and the propulsion. At that time, we could perform a denial of service attack, and as the oil rig would float away because it could no longer be stabilized, a potential for a drive-off attack or a cable shear could happen. So, lessons learned yet again: insufficient segregation between IT and OT, poor passwords, default usernames and passwords, compile time hardening not used, stack canaries, etc. No firmware signing, secure boot, and complex supply chains. And we're finding that the same mistakes are being made over and over again. Though large OT vendors are learning, they're led by Siemens and Stuxnet. I mean, we all know. Hopefully, we all know as security people about Stuxnet, which is fascinating. If you don't look it up, it's yeah. So legacy drag, long lifespans, reluctance from operators to patch because they're going to bring down the processes. And smaller OT vendors are slow to catch up. And of course, don't publish photos of your systems because that's just asking for trouble. Tactical advice, because at the end of a penetration test or something similar, it's always good to give advice to your clients. Make sure that when you're discussing a contract with a new supplier, that security is embedded in the procurement process with legal recourse. Do you have hard-coded backdoor accounts? Do you accredit your installer network for security expertise? Because as mentioned several times about third parties, these guys, they just want to swoop in, they want to finish their work, make sure everything's done, and they want to leave. They don't really care how they do that at the end of the day, hence the jump box, etc. Do you have a vulnerability disclosure policy? Because that in conjunction with the next one, can you show me a worked example of a real vulnerability? Shows the maturity of a company. If they're going to fight you tooth and nail to disprove you or to make your job as difficult as possible when you try to help them and their clients, then they're probably not the sort of people that you want to be fostering a long-term relationship with. Just something to bear in mind. And don't believe the marketing hype and rush to the cloud. As a tester for APIs and for cloud systems, I can tell you that we're still getting a lot of problems with both broken authentication and IDORs, indirect object references, due to bad coding practices. I'm sure many people who test cloud will say the same thing. So don't be afraid for testing for security. So if you're going to get switches and you're going to get routers and that, send it to a third-party testing company. I mean, a lot of the time you want to make sure that if you're installing stuff on your network, that it's not going to do something naughty like the HK Vision cameras did with the UPnP, for instance. So it's always good to have a new set of eyes that can actually take a look and see what's going on. Also accept that some security issues can't be fixed, and you just have to create defensive walls around them, make sure there's defense in depth, and make sure contractors maintain them, because as usual, like we said, some of them can be quite lazy. And don't rush to connect your systems. So this is to do with convergence yet again. And if you do converge stuff, make sure it's done properly, and mistakes like tar pits and that don't happen. LinkedIn Paul Brownridge, pen test partners. We've got lots of fun blogs. We do all kinds of blogs, from aviation testing to we've got tons of stuff, really interesting stuff as well. And anybody want to get in contact with me, if they want the slides for that, please let me know. I've got a PDF version, and I'd be happy to set it on and discuss anything with them. So please let me know. Thanks, Ben.
Cool. Thank you so much, Paul. And thank you for also mentioning how cloud is the same problem where everything old is new again, because there are, as you obviously know, but there are a lot of issues that kind of were resolved, a decade, 2 decades ago, that are kind of coming back into cloud-based environments. So
absolutely, because there's just so much push all the time to integrate IoT technologies in strange, weird, and wonderful things, and cloud in everything, because it's the new kid, the sexy new kid on the block.
So we didn't have any questions while you're talking, but we just got one in the chat now. So any thought about quantum computing and maybe how it will impact IoT or IoT processing or IoT vulnerabilities?
Well, I think the main fear with quantum computing is how it's going to affect encryption. Right? At the end of the day, it's whether we're going to be able to affect the actual workings of IoT stuff. No, but if you can intercept and you can change the integrity of the data flowing to and from the IoT systems, we're going to have a really big problem, particularly when a lot of these IoT systems are sitting in our home networks. That's a big privacy concern, I think, for a lot of us.
Okay. Well, it looks like there aren't any more questions, but if there are any questions, feel free. I'm assuming that they can reach out to you on your contact information that's on the screen right now, correct?
Please, yeah, please do. That'd be great.
Perfect. Yeah, so that is everything we have for you all tonight. And again, thank you, Paul, for coming in and telling us how to test IoT and how basic issues might still be present even in systems that we kind of are allowing into our home networks.
All the time,
And
every day, every test.
yep. Yeah. And just looking ahead, we are planning for those of us in the Nova chapter, we're trying to get next month's meetup in person. So we're looking at Thursday, October 12th. We're going to try and get a location. We have the speaker already lined up. So hopefully everything will come together and we can do this in person next month. But again, thank you, Paul, for staying up and for sharing your incredible knowledge with us. So
no worries. Anytime.
That out of the way, I'm going to end the stream and I will see you all next time. So take care.
Thanks, Ben. Bye-bye.